Good. Thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. Thanks to the audience for being here. As Brian just well introduced, this is a paper that provides empirical evidence on just the kinds of university allocation schemes that Nicole talked about a few minutes ago. The starting point for this talk is the big question of who should have access to elite public research universities. And there's been a long hundreds of years of history of a single answer to that question, which is roughly test-based meritocracy. And there are a series of arguments favoring this kind of mechanism. Top students may be most prepared for selective university education, and providing them that education may be good for entrepreneurship and innovation. This kind of mechanism helps sort successful students into impactful and highly cognitive occupations, and it incentivizes K-12 school learning. If students perform well, then they'll have greater access to elite universities. In recent decades, there's been a push for an alternative answer to this question, advocating for broad representation, which can help identify high ability but low opportunity students who may have had low-resourced high schools. This kind of admissions mechanism can improve economic mobility by promoting lower income students, providing them educational resources that they would otherwise not have access to. And this in turn can provide spillover benefits to the disadvantaged communities that these students might be pulled from. What I'm going to do today is to discuss one available race-blind, access-oriented admissions mechanism implemented by the University of California from 2001 to 2011. So eligibility in the local context, as the program was known, or ELC, guaranteed selective university admission to the top 4% of students from nearly all California high schools, public and private. And these students in the top 4% were selected strictly on the basis of grades, irrespective of standardized test scores. The reason this policy, in theory, might work is that there's substantial stratification across California high schools and across high schools in most regions. There are higher preparation and lower preparation high schools. And so there are some high schools that sent very few students to selective universities. And this top 4% policy might provide greater access to students from those schools. This talk is going to ask and answer three questions about ELC. The first is a question of function, literally which students enrolled at selective universities as a result of this policy, and how many such students were there. The second question is about impact, what happened to these students over the 5 to 10 years after they enrolled at selective universities as a result of admission through ELC. And the third is going to be a question about politics. To what degree was this policy politically sustainable and or scalable relative to alternative access-oriented admissions policies that are being tried in experiments across the country and across the world. So before I dive into empirical analysis of this study, I just want to give you a sense of what I observe. So the data set that I'm going to use comprises all applications to the 10-campus University of California system. So the University of California is a world-renowned public university system. It comprises 10 largely selective universities. It's tasked with educating the top 12.5% of students who graduate California high schools, though the definition of who those top 12.5% may be is left up to the university. So this is a highly selective public research university. I'm linking all of their applications through the period in which this admissions mechanism was implemented to nationwide enrollment and degree information, even if the student didn't enroll at the University of California, as well as to early career California earnings. So I'll see what these students earn in their early careers between the ages of 24 and 26, soon after they graduate college in most cases. And the primary research design that I'll use today is a regression discontinuity design at high school's ELC eligibility threshold. So to give you a sense of exactly what I'm doing here, I think it's useful just to look at an example. So this is a plot that shows you the proportion of students who are admitted to UC Davis, a mid-tier, highly selective public research university in the UC system. The proportion of those students who are admitted along an x-axis of how far these students are away from their own high school's 96th percentile threshold. Or in other words, In order to determine the top 4% of students by grades, you need to choose a number such that everyone with grades with GPAs above that number are going to be ELC eligible, guaranteed admission, and everyone below that number may or may not be admitted to highly selective public universities on the basis of their other admissions characteristics. In this plot, the black dots are bin scatter plots. This is just the average proportion of students admitted to Davis. And so, for instance, you can see here 0.3 GPA points below their high school's threshold, about 60% of students on average across California were admitted to UC Davis, even if they were 0.3 GPA points below the threshold. So these students were admitted on the basis of their standardized test scores, their high grades, and other characteristics of those students. You can see that the proportion of admitted students grows as students' GPAs rise. Of course, higher grade students are going to be more likely to be admitted to this research university. And then there's a jump right at the threshold of 20 percentage points. Or in other words, as soon as these students become ELC eligible, they become on average 20 percentage points more likely to be admitted to UC Davis because, of course, you can see admission to UC Davis is essentially guaranteed to all of these students above the threshold. So here you can just get a sense of how this policy is working. It is guaranteeing admission to students who have grades above their own high school's eligibility threshold. However, there's a lot of heterogeneity across high schools. So on the left here, you can see what's going on at California's top high schools as ranked by high school standardized test scores. And on the right, you can see what's happening at high schools in the bottom quartile of standardized test scores. So on the left, you can see ELC eligibility hardly matters for these students because most of them are already being admitted to UC Davis. It hardly matters that they be guaranteed admission because they can already get in. Whereas students from the bottom quartile of high schools become substantially more likely to be admitted to UC Davis by on the order of 40 to 50 percentage points as a result of their ELC eligibility. This is because these students come from lower tier high schools. Most of them have lower standardized test scores. And so the policy bites more. It does more to increase these students' likelihood of admission. UC Davis, as well as 3 other UC campuses, the campuses at San Diego, Irvine, and Santa Barbara, all near guaranteed admission to these ELC eligible students. And you can see this is showing the likelihood of all UC applicants that they enroll at one of these 4 UC campuses among students coming from the bottom quartile of California high schools. You can see the change in admissions actually changes which university these students enroll at. About 16 percentage points more students just to the right of the threshold enroll at these 4 UC campuses relative to students just below the threshold who are not provided the admissions guarantee. In total, if you add this up, this is about 700 to 800 students per year who are enrolling at these highly selective universities just because they were provided an admissions guarantee by ELC. 58 or about 60% of those students came from California's bottom quartile of high schools. Who were these students? So here what I'm doing is comparing these students' test scores, family incomes, the share of these students who are underrepresented minorities or Black and Hispanic. I'm comparing the UC baseline, this is the average at the universities where they're going to enroll, to the ELC participants who gained access to the universities as a result of ELC. You can see that the ELC participants had an average SAT score that was 270 points lower than the average student at a school where they enrolled. That's on a base of 2,400. So these students had a 1,500 out of 2,400 versus the average of an 1,800 out of 2,400. And students coming from the bottom quartile of California high schools had even lower SAT scores of 1,400 out of 2,400 on average. These students had relatively high school GPAs. After all, they were selected on the basis of their high school GPAs. But they had substantially lower family incomes, and they were substantially more likely to be Black or Hispanic than the average student at these 4 UC campuses where they were able to enroll. So for example, ELC participants from the bottom quartile of California high schools were about 60% Black or Hispanic, relative to only 20% Black or Hispanic at the schools where they enrolled. What happens to these students in the years following? Well, these students became substantially more likely to earn a college degree from any American institution as you can see here on the left. So there's a jump right at the eligibility threshold of about 5 percentage points. That can only be driven by the fact that these students above the threshold are much more likely to enroll at these 4 UC campuses than the students below the threshold. And here on the right, you can see the average earnings obtained by all of these applicants in the years after they applied to the University of California. These students above the threshold were more likely than these students below the threshold to enroll at the University of California, for which reason they obtained earnings of, on average, $2,000 higher. Though really, you should be multiplying this $2,000 by 6, because remember, only 1 in 6 students switch into the University of California as a result of their ELC eligibility. For those switchers, the ELC participants, their earnings are $10,000 to $15,000 higher than they would have been if they had not had access to the University of California through the ELC policy. So I'm running out of time. Let me just briefly discuss the mechanism, the politics undergirding this mechanism. University admissions policies are complicated. They require buy-in from senior public officials, from university administrators, and from the admissions staff that are actually making admissions decisions. And between 2001 and 2011, ELC had buy-in from each of these groups. In 2012, senior public officials made the decision to attempt to expand ELC to the top 9% of students from every high school, under the belief that the policy was working and this could further expand access to more students. However, the admissions staff at nearly every UC campus chose to stop substantively participating in the ELC program. And so as a result, ELC, as it is still known, has actually enrolled approximately 0 students at any selective university in California as a result of their ELC eligibility since 2012. The policy expanded, but because not everyone was on board, it was defanged. And the net de facto result of the policy has been nothing in the last 9 years. So what are the takeaways here? Top percent mechanisms can succeed as a result of stratification across high schools. These mechanisms increase enrollment among underrepresented minority and lower income students who have lower test scores but performed well at their lower performing high schools. And these policies pretty tremendously benefit targeted students. University quality is an educational resource. When you provide selective university access to students who would otherwise not be able to obtain it, the value to those students is large in terms of both degree attainment and postgraduate earnings. But these policies don't always work as intended. Both the mechanism and the intricacies of its implementation determine student outcomes, and just because you put a mechanism into place doesn't mean that many students will be benefited, as we've seen over the last 9 years with ELC. So I'll stop there. Hopefully there are 2 minutes for questions, and you can see the full papers on my website. Thanks to all of you.